following program contains mature themes on a thematic subject. Viewer discretion is strictly advised. State of the Nation is an opinion-based program. The thoughts and opinions shared within this program are not intended to offend or disregard anyone's perspectives or beliefs. We aim to foster open dialogue, encourage critical thinking, and explore thought-provoking subjects. Recognizing the importance of diversity and inclusion, this program welcomes all viewpoints and cherishes the right to express them freely. This program also contains the opinions of the participants and does not reflect the views and beliefs of the Derana Media Network. The network believes in a safe space for all ideas to be expressed and on its duty to create such a platform for free speech. Viewer discretion is strictly advised.
Good evening. Tonight, a world that is moving fast and a nation trying to keep up. Growth slowing at home while the global economy regains its footing. And education reforms that promises tomorrow but struggles with today. An IMF program that steadies the books while daily life remains heavy. Global institutions losing their grip as conflict spreads and power politics reshaping the rules in real time. These are not separate conversations, they are threads of the same story. Tonight we ask whether Sri Lanka is adapting to the world as it is or paying the price for reacting too late. For insights, analysis and opinions, tonight I'll speak to the Deputy Minister of Education, Dr. Madhura Seneviratne, Director for Research at the International Development Economic Association, Professor Chandru Chandrasekhar. Former Minister of Health, Dr. Channa Jayasumana. Former Sri Lankan Ambassador to the UN, Dr. Dayan Jayathilake. Veteran journalist and analyst, Mohan Samaranayake. And educational reforms expert, Niyantani Kadiragama. Good evening, I'm Mahieash Johnney, and this is the State of the Nation. A very good evening and welcome to the State of the Nation. Now, thank you very much for spending part of your evening with us. We have a packed show tonight with several important subjects to unpack and some timely conversations to have. So let's get straight into it. But first, time for a reality check. The world is changing faster than most of us want to admit. Now, according to the World Bank's Global Economic Prospects report released this month, Sri Lanka's growth is expected to slow from an estimated 4.6% in 2025 to 3.5% in 2026 and further down to 3.1% in 2027. That's not politics, that's math, well, according to the World Bank. What makes this more uncomfortable is a contrast. The World Bank says the global economy is holding up better than expected, with growth projected at 2.6% this year and 2.7% in 2027, largely driven by stronger performance in the United States. Now, in other words, the world is growing and Sri Lanka is slowing. And this is where we need to be honest with ourselves. Tourism, garments, tea, rubber and gems still matter, but they are no longer enough. These sectors are exposed to global shocks, customer demands and geopolitical uncertainty. Relying on them all alone in today's economy is risky, and the numbers are already warning us. Now, the World Bank points to structural weaknesses and lingering effects of the crisis as key reasons for the slowdown. If those remain unfixed, the dangers isn't just slower growth, it's another financial crisis down the road. So the choice is clear. The government now needs to find new avenues of revenue, diversify the economy and adapt to a more complex global system. They gotta do it really fast because the world is changing whether we like it or not. And if Sri Lanka doesn't move with it, the cost won't show up in reports. It will show up in our day-to-day lives. We'll be right back. Welcome back everyone to the State of the Nation. Now, in our lead story tonight, Sri Lanka's unreformable educational reforms. Now, this isn't a small policy tweak, it's a full reset of how our children are taught. On paper, the reform sounds right. Less memorizing, more thinking, skills that actually matter today. And that's something parents have been wanting for many years. But big reforms only work if the system delivering them is ready. That means trained teachers, proper classrooms and technology that works. And that's where the gap shows. Some schools will move ahead quickly, especially in the urban areas. Many others, especially in rural and estate areas, are still struggling with basics. Then there's the whole question of no one like asking, what about the money? Reform is expensive. Sri Lanka is still recovering from an economic crisis while managing tight budgets. So the real question is simple. Can we do this properly across the entire country with the money we have? Because rushed reforms doesn't create progress, it creates confusion. Education reform is necessary. By all means, it is necessary. But it has to be realistic, fair, properly funded, and clearly explained. Because when education gets it right, the future improves, and when it gets it wrong, generations pay the price. Well, tonight we will get views of what is going on from the government, the opposition, and a third-party observation as well. To get the government's point of view, joining me now is the Deputy Minister of Education, Dr. Madhura Seneviratne. Thank you very much, Minister, for your time. Really appreciate it. I understand that the situation regarding reforms is very tricky. I honestly, sincerely believe that we really need educational reforms, and the plans you have put out is quite promising. Now, let me ask this pertinent question. You know that successive governments have tried to bring in reforms only to die on the hill later on. Why wasn't the government careful in ironing out issues that right now seems to be really careless mistakes, like unnecessary links in books? And has the government taken action against people who are responsible for this?
Yes, Mahieash, now when we consider to that particular incidents, the people's trust is what we should maintain. So as a ministry, we have taken the initial steps very rapidly. That is, first step was the fact-finding committee. On this committee, there's a preliminary inquiry which is conducted by the disciplinary authority, and at the same time CID, there's a part from CID, because to clarify whether there's foul play or not, or any kind of a third party involvement. So simultaneously these two inquiries are on the way, and we are expecting transparent results from those. Yes.
Well, Minister, the other criticism over the reforms is the money factor. What's the plan? I ask that because look at what's happening right now. Even last year, the government had ₹1 trillion in savings last year. Then Ditwa came, and now I think around 500 billion is going for that recovery projects as well. So meaning that you have some money put out for a project and then something else happens. So can the government really ensure the implementation of these reforms financially till the end?
Yes, Mahieash. When we considering starting from the beginning, actually, from last budget, there's a definite allocations for various areas of these reforms. Structural reforms and the teacher training, human resources, so on. So then Dita came. By the way, now for Dita cyclone, as you said, this sum of money has allocated for that affected people and various things, issues. So, but the thing is, now we have definitely we are conducting, we are moving forward these reforms, and these are two separate areas. I mean, it's not affected by these allocations, but for sure there's some issues with school infrastructure damages are there. So we are considering those things as well, and with the help of UNICEF, we are repairing those schools, and sometimes the connectivity was lost, and actually from Ditha we are recovering, and we can move forward with reforms.
Indeed. Minister, what's the next step from the government on education? Right now it's paused, I think, till 2027. Is this slowly going to go away like what happened with previous governments?
Yes, it is not paused actually. We are moving forward, with these particular incidents, module, there's a kind of issue. But, the whole process, we have segregated into 5 different sectors, pillars, as we say. So, so those pillars, as an example, infrastructure, human resources, examinations, and disseminations of informations. So these pillars are moving forward, but only and the grade 1 with these reforms, they are initiating their studies on 29th. So it's not paused actually. We are moving forward. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Minister. Let's leave it at that. That was the Deputy Minister of Education, Dr. Madhura Seneviratne. Appreciate it indeed.
Thank you.
Well, I'm sure the opposition has a lot to say about this. After all, they are the opposition. Let's bring in former Minister of Health, Dr. Channa Jayasumana from the Sarvajana Balaya. Thank you very much, Doctor, for taking the time to join me and also to make some comments on the educational reforms. Doctor, now educational reforms are a necessity. We must do it. But why is the opposition so negative to this government's reforms?
Mahieash, in fact, these reforms have been introduced haphazardly, without a proper plan, without proper intention. In the name of reform, what they have done is, they simply divided existing syllabus and introduced new modules, and certain web links have been hooked for these modules. This approach is irrational and unproductive. At the same time, there's a great suspicion in this community. Who is behind these reforms? What is the intention? What is the objective? What is the mission of these reforms? So we object these reforms. In fact, this is not a reform. although they name it as a reform, this is not a reform, because a proper reform must be bring with the extreme care, because the future of whole generation is depend on education reform. So this is the simple reason for our objection. On the other hand, there are several modules have been introduced. In those modules, if you take this history module, there's no history in this history module. There's no Sinhala in Sinhala module. There's no science in science module. So that is the issue with these so-called reforms.
Okay, if you say this is wrong, then what's the alternative? No reforms? That sounds very unfair by the children.
No, I am emphasizing, reforms are needed. But here, this is a political agenda, just a mere political agenda. There's no reform here. If we take as an example, Mahieash, only the first term modules for grade 6 children are introduced. In these reforms, we need to see what are the textbook or modules for grade 7, 8, 9 and 10. In the history book, there's no history. In the Sinhala book, there's no proper Sinhala. In the science book, there's no proper science. So this is haphazardly introduced political agenda, not an educational reform. That's why we are against this. But for a proper educational reform, yes, we are for proper educational reform.
Doctor, what exactly would the opposition would suggest that the government must do, and at what point would you support these reforms? Because you clearly agree we need reforms, so what's the middle ground?
First, the objective of the reform should be declared, and the people behind these reforms should be declared. The intentions of these reforms should be declared. Unless the mobile data providers, smartphone businessmen get undue advantage of these proposals. In the Sri Lanka, still more than 50% of the landmass, they don't have proper internet access. So how can these children go and access to the internet? In the modules, certain web names are mentioned. Children in the towns, main cities, main towns, they can access to those websites, but not the rural students. That's one of the major issues. Then there's a allegation to the government and also the people who led these reforms that there's a hidden agenda to promote LGBTQ through these reforms. There are certain evidences also appeared. So government should declare whether there's a hidden agenda or not. That's why we are asking to reveal all modules in the same time. Without seeing these reforms, how someone demand, we need reforms. This is half-baked. This is half-baked reform. It is not revealed. There are great suspicions in everywhere. So first of all, the intention, objectives, and people behind this reform should be declared, and these matters should be subjected to enough discussion in the society. That's our demand.
All right, let's leave it at that. That was former Minister of Health, Dr. Channa Jayasumana from the Sarvajana Balaya, and the response from the opposition on the matter. Now, we also want to get an academic point of view on this. So joining me now is Niyanthani Kandirgamar. She's an educational reforms analyst, and also she's a PhD researcher in education at the University of Massachusetts in the USA. Thank you very much, Niyanthani, for taking the time to speak to me. How do you see the current reforms? What's your opinion?
Well, thank you for having me on this show, Mahieash. I think the current reforms have received negative reception for two main reasons. One is that when the NPP government came into power and they were elected with a majority in parliament, there was the expectation that the government will initiate a new set of reforms and not continue in the same trajectory that previous governments had proposed. And the second reason, of course, is that when the government announced the reforms in July last year, it came as a surprise to many, including those within the education sector, because the government had failed to discuss and develop the education reforms together with all the constituent parties in the education sector, and there was no opportunity to debate the reforms. In my opinion, there is one major concern with the general education reform process based on what has been announced. And that is that there is the idea of general education where you provide students with a holistic education, looking into their physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual needs. The government has decided to curtail that kind of general education only up to grade 9, and then the rest of the schooling to be focused around narrow job-oriented education. I think this is one of the biggest concerns, and we have to relook at this reform.
Now, one of the things that is glaring for me in these reforms is the vastness of it and how underprepared everyone involved is. Now, government says regarding teachers, they give 3 months of training. Unions say that's not enough. And then, of course, the resources gap. Let's say the government launches this as it is in defiance. What would be the end result?
That's true. The education sector has gone through many challenges in the recent past. The COVID pandemic affected the education sector, the economic crisis, and now Cyclone Ditwa. So already it's at a very weak position, and it's not strong enough to carry out such drastic reforms. And the second issue, and I think this is one major concern, is that even if we have well-constructed reforms, without adequate resources being pooled in to support those reforms, the reforms are going to fail. And here we all know that in Sri Lanka over the past few decades, the allocation for education has been very low. It's one of the lowest in the world right now. We only allocate about 2% of GDP into the education sector. And without adequate resources, we can't expect the education reforms to be successful. So that, I think, is a major concern. And we have to figure out a way to ensure that allocations for education are increased. It is also one of the major promises that the NPP government made when they came into power, that they will gradually increase the allocation for education to 6% before their tenure is over.
I'm sure, Anthony, you and I both agree that reforms are very much needed. So what would you advise the government to do? Because rather than stopping these reforms, how can they make it better, in your opinion?
Yes, I agree that the reforms are very much needed. And the government has to ensure that they consult everyone within the sector and with parents, teachers, and groups outside the education sector as well, because a consultative process is what people expect, and I hope the government will ensure that they do this. The second concern for me in relation to moving forward is that successive governments in Sri Lanka have been influenced by international financial institutions who provide funding for the education sector as well. And unfortunately, because of the loan commitments that they have made, they struggle to move away from the agendas that have been set for the education sector and the overall framing for education sector by these international financial institutions. So moving forward, I think it's very important that the government figures out a way to not be constrained by the loans and the agendas that the World Bank and the ADB are proposing for our education sector.
Indeed. All right, let's leave it at that. That was Niyanthini Kadiragama, an educational reforms analyst. Thank you very much. A quick break now, back with more State of the Nation. Welcome back, everyone, to the State of the Nation. The IMF team is back in Sri Lanka carrying out its 5th review, and the message is very familiar. Even after a cyclone, electricity prices must go up. They didn't say it that bluntly. Of course, the polite version was about cost recovery and fiscal discipline, stuff that we have heard over and over again. Even as the country deals with Cyclone Ditwa's recovery. So despite the Public Utilities Commission saying that there won't be a hike in the first half of the year, we will definitely have a big one in the second half. We asked for a sit-down interview with the IMF delegation to ask some tough questions one-on-one, and that request was denied. I wonder why. Maybe I don't dress well or something. Anyways, let's stop pretending the IMF is a global emergency room saving dying economies. If that were true, countries would enter IMF programs and eventually walk out independent and economically flourishing. But history tells another story. Argentina keeps returning for more and more money from the IMF just to keep their nation afloat. Pakistan keeps coming back as well. Greece went through the years of austerity, lost a generation and still hasn't fully recovered. But these aren't accidents. They're patterns. The IMF doesn't revive economies. It stabilizes them enough to keep debts paid. And it doesn't operate in a political vacuum. I mean, listen to the former economic advisor to the government of India, Dr. Arvind Subramaniam, who was addressing a conference organized by our own central bank. The entity's governor, in fact, is one of the biggest fans of the IMF, and he has been some of the first people to push the country to declare bankruptcy and go be at the mercy of the IMF. Well, technically, it was the former president who declared the bankruptcy, which was so detrimental to this nation. But who advised him? Anyway, listen to Dr. Subramaniam in what he says, what Sri Lanka must do with this IMF program.
The question that you posed, or that I thought I would answer, is stabilization is achieved, now how do you reignite growth? There are two pictures that I said that haunt me about Sri Lanka. Why is Sri Lanka always in IMF arrangements? Sri Lanka has to liberate itself from the IMF. It's that Sri Lanka should not have a reason, should not have the underlying instability to have to rely on the IMF. Because, it is a pattern, it's a consistent pattern. And it's something that one cannot take for granted that we will, that we've escaped.
That was a former economic advisor to the government of India, Dr. Arvind Subramaniam, here in Colombo about, I think, last week. Now, its biggest shareholder is the United States. The IMF's biggest shareholder is the United States. And the formula is familiar. Cut subsidies, raise taxes, shrink the state. Now, on paper, things look stable. On the street, life gets harder. IMF has one goal, keep the US economic policy accepted all around the world and keep nations that they have interest towing the line and never fully recovering. And here's the uncomfortable truth for Sri Lanka. While people struggle with the cost of living and daily distractions, institutions like the IMF quietly shape the future, the financial future of this country and the future of our children will inherit long before we realize what has been decided. Let's bring in Global Research Director at the International Development Economic Association, Professor Chandrasekhar. Thank you very much, Professor. Good to see you. Well, the 5th review is already happening with the IMF and the government regarding the emergency fund facility of 2.9 billion. Earlier, the IMF said, Professor, that if we stick to their plan, economy will recover, and then, of course, there were fanfare by all sides saying that Sri Lanka's economy recovered really fast. I'm sure there's a bit of truth in there. But now, After one cyclone, the World Bank says growth is going to be slow. Isn't it fair, Professor, for skeptics of the IMF programs to point the finger at this and say, there we go, we told you so?
Well, I would say that, of course, we shouldn't only look at it in terms of what happened post the cyclone, which was terrible. And let me start by saying, Mahieash, thanks for having me here. So we shouldn't attribute it only to the cyclone. If you have an IMF program which is requiring the government to actually substantially reduce its expenditures in order to move the primary deficit from something which was close to a deficit of 3% to a primary surplus in a period of 3 to 4 years, then obviously that curtailment of expenditure is going to slow growth. So this whole idea that you can do this kind of adjustment and get higher growth itself is fundamentally wrong. Secondly, of course, you have to come to terms with the fact that these are vulnerable countries. Sri Lanka is a vulnerable country. The vulnerability is partly due to what happened in terms of the development process in the north, which resulted in the increase in extreme events of the kind like the Tua was. So what you need is an international community which must, one, understand that you cannot have curtailment of expenditure as an adjustment mechanism if you want a recovery which actually gives some succor to the people or some benefit to a people who've gone through substantial suffering. And secondly, that they should see this as a responsibility not only because of the unequal international division of labor, but because of the fact that they have made these economies extremely vulnerable, and that is what is showing through. So while Ditwa is going to make things much worse for Sri Lanka, things were bad enough under the kind of program which the IMF had imposed. So I think that this whole talk of the GDP, because fundamentally what is the adjustment which was needed? What was the adjustment which was needed was to give access to Sri Lanka to foreign exchange resources, which it had lost out during COVID, which it loses out on a long-term chronic basis because of the inability to diversify its economy. You need to address that problem. It's not really to just raise the rate of growth and raise it by actually suggesting that by curtailing public expenditure and reducing a whole set of measures which actually constitutes sort of marginal support to the poorest sections of the population, that you're going to be in a position to be able to ensure the recovery of this economy. So I think that there is a fundamental inability or I'd say the fundamental dishonesty about the way in which this whole argument has been framed, and we should not actually enter that terrain of discourse, but actually look at it independently.
Absolutely. Professor, now last year, the Sri Lankan government managed to save around 1 trillion rupees, that's around $3.2 billion. Now the government hopes to use half of it to rebuild infrastructure after the cyclone. Now, since the money is anyway being pumped back into the economy, wouldn't Sri Lanka's economy might see a positive growth despite the lower outlook by the World Bank?
I don't understand what this savings means. Is this savings, an argument that because of the fact that we've been able to reduce our expenditures and make some tax adjustments, get some additional tax from import of motor vehicles, which of course is going to make things worse for the balance payments, that because you've actually got this thing through a curtailment of expenditure and a minor increase in revenues, this is, if you call this the savings, now how can you then take that savings which you got by curtailing expenditure to undertake expenditure? So unless the point which is being made is that this allows you flexibility to redistribute expenditure, so that if you've reduced expenditures, which gives you the savings, however much you estimate it, and you can use that to allocate it somewhere else, you're basically saying that would be an adjustment in which you don't go along with IMF targets with regard to the primary deficit and the fiscal deficit. So I don't understand how you can have a situation in which you say that I'll stick to IMF targets, including the targets on deficit spending, and yet speak of the fact that I have savings which I can now spend. Partly you had those savings because you accepted a kind of austerity program which allowed you to curtail expenditure and impose some marginal taxes in order to get some revenues to actually reduce your primary and fiscal deficit, or reduce your two deficits. If that's the case, then what you're saying is I'm going to go away from IMF targets because I'm just going to use that money, if that money actually exists, I'm going to use that to to now allocate it to a different set of expenditures. And in this case, you're saying that it's going to be a set of expenditures to come to terms with the devastating impact. In any case, the expenditure which the Sri Lankan government is suggested is needed to deal with this problem is being estimated at, I think, 72 billion Sri Lankan rupees, or something about 0.2% of GDP. But estimates on the actual impact of the loss which was suffered as a result of this cyclone vary from 4 to 7 billion. I mean, you're talking about something like 4 to 5% to 7% of GDP. So I really don't know what this argument is. Firstly, what is this savings? And if that savings actually exists, which I don't think it is, how that is going to help the government actually address this deep problem.
All right, Professor Chandru Chandrasekhar from the International Development Economic Association, thank you very much. Appreciate it. We'll take a short break. Be right back. This is The State of the Nation. Welcome back, everyone, to the State of the Nation. Well, I got news for you. The world is falling apart. Trump is behaving like a child, and the UN is starting to look less like the world's peacekeeper and more like the world's most expensive group chat. It was created to prevent war. Yet, in the past decade, we have watched major conflicts grind on with no meaningful UN stop button in sight. Syria, Yemen, Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan, and the Security Council keeps hitting the same ball: veto power. Since 1946, the veto has been used nearly 300 times, which is a polite way of saying 5 countries can block action whenever it suits them. And yes, it costs serious money to run the machinery. The UN's regular budget is in the billions each year before you even count peacekeeping and other agencies, humanitarian agencies' budgets as well. So the question isn't whether the UN needs reforms, it's whether it needs a structural rebuild. Either limit the veto in crisis or accept that the current model protects superpowers' interests first and everyone else's survival second. Now, here's the part where it gets almost comedic. While Donald Trump is driving world nuts with Greenland talks, and then he has Denmark and Europeans on the edge, and while Venezuela says that the United States captured its sitting president in a military operation, the UN's biggest headline conversation is whether a woman will lead the organization next as its Secretary General. And yes, a woman Secretary General would be historic. But symbolism does not stop wars, structures do. So if the UN wants to be taken seriously again, it has to choose keep managing optics while the world falls apart, or redesign the system so it can actually act where it matters without being held hostage by veto politics, or just go with the new board of peace, I guess, that Donald Trump which he really wants to take into effect as the next best option as a global organization that can replace the UN. Joining me now is veteran journalist and author Mohan Samaranayake. He has been reporting on world affairs for decades. Thank you very much, Mr. Samaranayake, for your time. Mr. Samaranayake, now talking about credibility and double standards, countries like Sri Lanka faces constant scrutiny from UN bodies. Resolutions, reports, international pressure. Meanwhile, the United States has launched wars without UN approval, imposed unilateral sanctions, and repeatedly used its veto to shield itself and its allies. yet faces no consequences. How does the UN justify this imbalance? And can an institution that enforces its rules selectively still claim moral authority?
Exactly, Mahieash. Yes. For a long time, the powerful countries are using the United Nations to further their own political and economic and geopolitical interests. So again, my point is that this is not inherent in the organization itself, but the crux of the problem is with the existing world order, really world disorder, where rich and powerful countries are freely acting to further their political and economic and military security interests. So if UN is to be effective, then there has to be a kind of multipolar world instead of this unipolar world. But fortunately for the mankind, this unipolar world that came into existence with the collapse of the Soviet Union is now dying. It is definitely come to an end, and a new multipolar world is in the making. If that happens, then only the organization can be made effective and efficient and useful to the world community.
Finally, Mr. Samaranayake, if the UN cannot stop wars, cannot restrain powerful nations, and cannot apply its own charter equally, then what exactly is the UN today? Doesn't it badly need reforms? Or should we ought to be doing away with it and come up with a better system, like perhaps Donald Trump's new Board of Peace?
I think I have to repeat what I have said before. UN cannot act on its own in intervening in affairs between states, because the powerful countries do not allow UN to intervene in such a manner. Therefore, there has to be reforms. But for the reforms to be effective, there has to be that consensus among the powerful countries. Then we come to the square number one. That is this existing world order dominated by powerful countries. That is the problem with the United Nations. In my view, the problem is not this organization itself. But my view is that it is better to have even in the name such an organization, rather than we are not having anything at all.
Absolutely. Well, let's leave it at that. Mr. Mohan Samaranayake, veteran journalist and author, thank you very much. A quick break once again. This is the State of the Nation. Back in a moment. Welcome back, everyone, to the State of the Nation. Now, people who knows me personally knows this about me. I am a massive fan of Donald J. Trump. I watched him get cornered, bullied, and relentlessly targeted by the left-wing machinery of the Biden administration. Lawsuits, investigations, media pylons, everything throwing at one man to make sure that he never comes back into the White House. And then came that moment, shot at, blood on his face, and instead of retreating, he stood up and rallied his base. Politically, that's cinematic. I love the comeback. I said it on the show even. When he returned to the White House, that I said that he was working and working hard for the American people. And now, Mr. President, maybe can you please work just a little less hard? because even for me, this is getting a bit much. Trump's new favorite weapon seems to be taxes, or rather, threats of taxes. Don't like the picture I just painted? Well, you get taxed. Don't want to join my exclusive club that cost $1 billion to enter, and you don't want to enter? You get taxed. Don't let me take over another country, so you're going to, oppose that and not make me forcefully annex it? You get taxed. I mean, come on. Global affairs right now are at a fever pitch. One wrong move and the world goes bonkers. Either we are staring at the edge of a much larger conflict because of Trump's erratic style, or this is the time all useless systems in the world that cost billions to maintain with taxpayer money, like the UN, the NATO, the UNHRC, other politically motivated organizations, get exposed on its ineffectiveness, or we are all being dragged along for a reality show that never seems to end. Yes, the US economy is growing. The numbers backs that up. Trump wants to be remembered as the greatest president America ever had. Fair enough. But here's the question. The rest of the world is quietly needs to ask, growth for America at what cost? And more importantly, who pays the bill when the rest of the world starts pushing back? Well, joining me now is our former Sri Lankan ambassador to the UN, Dr. Dayan Jayathilake. Thank you so much, Doctor, for your time. I mean, can you really make sense as to what's going on with Trump? Is it just chaos for chaos' sake, or is this a really good move for America to stay at the economic helm for a very long period of time?
Well, thanks, Mahieash, for having me. It's neither. Donald Trump isn't some crazy guy who is engaging in chaos for the sake of chaos, nor are his moves very smart moves. What he's doing is he is disrupting, even smashing the global economic and diplomatic architecture that the United States built, primarily the United States, but others as well, in the post-World War II period. He is not the first one to try to change it. George W. Bush also invaded Iraq without a UN Security Council endorsement. He too began this process of deviating from the norms of the world order that the US primarily founded. The reason is that the United States, or the Republican Party, or more correctly the hawks in the Republican Party, found that America wasn't getting what it thought it was getting from globalization. The Chinese were doing as well, or maybe even better. The Russians were standing up straight, and the US leadership was not what it used to be. It couldn't dominate the world in the way it wanted. Now, Donald Trump is trying to change that back to a situation maybe 150 years ago when the United States could use gunboat diplomacy, open imperialism, and say, I want that, I'm going to take that, I'm going to declare war if I don't get it, I want to buy that other place. So he's trying to, he's a real estate redeveloper, so he's trying to do with the world architecture what real estate developers do. Sometimes they level it and build again. He's trying to do that, but it's difficult to do, and he is damaging the United States by trying to do so.
Doctor, what do you think might happen with Iran? It's becoming dicier by the minute. If America does anything, perhaps what they did in Venezuela, both other major superpowers are promising action. That's China and Russia. Possibly, are we at the cusp of a major war?
Well, Mahieash, I don't think Russia or China is going to do anything militarily to defend Iran or against the United States. Yes, there are 2 US aircraft carriers headed towards Iran as we speak, and they could be in place in theater any day now. But it's not going to be one-sided. Iran is not Venezuela. The Americans can't do a decapitation strike, and even if they do and they kill Ayatollah Khamenei, the Iranian military, the IRGC is very much intact, and they have a huge stockpile of ballistic missiles, of rockets, which they will use to hit American ships, American planes, and American bases in the region. They may even block the passage of oil. So there'll be huge damage to the United States, high casualties, unlike in Venezuela, and a severe economic shock.
Absolutely. Well, let's hope for the best. Former Sri Lankan ambassador to the UN, Dr. Dayan, Jayathilake, appreciate you talking to us. Thank you very much. Well, that was indeed a lot to cover in an hour. Hopefully, we managed to give you a different viewpoint so that you can think for yourself and that you are better informed than before. We really need to get our educational reforms right, and its core in addressing the issues we are facing, at least that it would not be carried to the future of our children's lives. Well, with that, we wrap up this edition of State of the Nation. Thank you very much for watching. Send us your comments to feedback.adncenglish@derana.lk or WhatsApp your feedback to 076-805-7933. We'll be back next week with views you can trust and opinions you cannot ignore. Thank you very much for watching. See you then. Bye for now.
You are the king of the divan, qu'elle me dit en passant. I am the king of the divan.